Princess Victoria, the original Queen Mother. Queen Victoria was known as the grandmother of Europe, but her own mother was also a Titan, with scandalous romances and disturbing parenting. Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg Saalfeld is one to learn about and how she moulded the future monarch of England. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. She was born into privilege before she gave birth to one of the most characteristically British monarchs the world has ever seen. Although her roots were very much not British, as she was German. She was born in 1786 to her parents Franz Frederick and her mother Countess Augusta, who were luminaries of the Teutonic House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. This was a highly privileged family, and they placed high expectations on their child. They controlled much of her life, and by the time she was 17 years old, they had married her to a man whom she had little to no decision in, the powerful Charles, Prince of Leiningen. This man was 2 decades older than her, so I doubt he would have been her first choice for a groom. He was widowed, and in a strange turn of events, his prior wife was none other than her own aunt, making for an awkward reunion. It was her obligation as a wife to produce children with this man, despite the considerable age gap between the pair. She did become pregnant the very first year, at just 18 years old. She gave birth to a boy, Prince Karl, and then another daughter, Theodora, 3 years later. Victoria was barely in her 20s and already a mother of 2. But she had higher ambitions for herself, and she wished to become as powerful as possible. Whatever disappointments Victoria's life had on the private front during these years, they definitely didn't show in public. It was her brother's choice in bride that would gain the family direct access to the British throne. Her brother Leopold married Charlotte, the Princess of Wales, who was the future heir to the throne, until one day it all came crashing down. In the summer of 1814, Victoria's much older husband, Prince Charles, passed away. She was left alone with 2 children, but if anyone could handle dire situations alone, it was her. It wasn't long before she became the regent for her son Karl, though this was only foreshadowing for her much bigger role in royalty, just as Victoria had gained momentum in her life again after losing her husband, an event that should have been filled with celebration for the birthing of an heir for her brother and the Princess of Wales, turned into a tragedy when the princess gave birth to a stillborn son. Shortly afterwards, the princess hemorrhaged and died, leaving behind a devastated Leopold who was heartbroken over the loss of his wife and child. England was utterly panicked about the loss of its heir. This prompted an enormous succession crisis, and Victoria was right in the middle of it. In the tragic aftermath of the Princess of Wales's death, an heir to the throne, Britain were desperate for an heir to take over the crown. All of the surviving male heirs of the current and ailing King George III were either in miserable, childless unions or were lifelong bachelors. Parliament made a desperate attempt to pay these men to settle down with a woman in the hopes that they could produce a healthy heir for the crown. So how does Victoria come into this quest for an heir of England? Her brother was already connected to the crown through his wife, as she was introduced to Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, and one of the sons of King George III. He proposed to her with the understanding that she would give him an heir for the crown, and she accepted with delight, This heir would be none other than Queen Victoria, the future monarch of the UK. Princess Victoria had little luck with men, it seemed, and this holy matrimony was no different, and it was full of scandals. Victoria's engagement to a prince of England seemed like happily ever after on the outside, but inside was a whole other story. Prince Edward was one of the bachelors that had refused to settle down before, and there was good reason for it. He was used to living the high life with the high-stake gambling tables, where he had catapulted himself into a world of debt. The newlywed Duke and Duchess of Kent were so broke they decided to go and live in Germany after their wedding in order to keep their costs down. Only a twist of fate was in store. She had become pregnant quickly, providing Edward with the heir he wholeheartedly desired. They rushed back to England so that their British heir was born in the country to which she would rule. In the spring of 1819, they moved into Kensington Palace to set up Victoria's brood nest, and a month later, history was made. The country had been waiting on an heir for their crown, and Victoria was able to give them just that when she birthed a little girl who they named Princess Alexandrina Victoria of Kent, the future Queen Victoria of England. Although her life should have been filled with rejoicing, it wasn't long until tragedy hit her life again. Only 8 short months after the birth of their baby, her husband Edward passed suddenly from pneumonia. In quick succession, further tragedy struck, and only 6 days later, his father, King George III, also passed away. The British throne was crumbling rapidly, and Victoria was yet again widowed at such a young age, with a young royal heir to nurture by herself. It would have been tempting for the young Duchess of Kent to have returned to her home in Germany, especially as she did not speak the language. She had a privileged life in a palace in Coburg that she could have escaped to, but instead she played a different hand, and it paid off for her. She had always been power-hungry, perhaps due to the high expectations that were put on her as a child, and how she had never found true love, but only gained husbands through political game-playing. She placed herself firmly in England and rolled the dice on her daughter's future, in the hope that she would one day gain the ultimate power over Europe. But unfortunately for her, her ride was not a smooth one to power. When she announced she would be staying in England, the people were not impressed. Her husband had left behind a mountain of debt, and so she requested that Parliament pay for her extravagant lifestyle, for her and her precious heir. They were not happy about this arrangement, and the solution they provided was downright insulting. They provided her with a impoverished and decaying room in Kensington Palace. She shared this life with a whole bunch of other downtrodden nobles who had fallen in hard times, proving just how little they thought of the princess and her heir. I doubt this was the welcome she was expecting, and one she probably felt she did not deserve, but by then she had bigger things to worry about. Victoria was outspoken on her plans for power, corruption and lies, and it didn't take long for her to make more rivals in the royal court. In 1830, she got herself in trouble with those with the most influence in the court. The year the king passed, she had made enemies with his successor, his brother William IV. He was perhaps bitter of the Duchess and her ability to provide the heir of England that he was never able to, and she made sure to use this to hold him over a barrel. William was elderly and had still not produced any legitimate children. His only option was to rely on this overzealous Duchess and her daughter to keep the line going. Their feud went both ways. King William had produced loads of illegitimate children with one of his mistresses, Dorothea Jordan. Victoria was disgusted by the debauched behaviour of William, and she refused to visit the English court because of it. She was so against the king, she refused her daughter to attend his coronation. This was supposedly because she didn't like the way that they were going to place her in the proceedings. The ceremony would not be about her, and so her excuses did not go unnoticed, branding her with a reputation for self-entitlement. She was able to use the air she had produced to act like the woman of the hour, and her feud escalated with William when she refused to acknowledge the letters from his wife Adeline. Not only did she refuse to stand with her at the horse stables, instead demanding that she stood alone, she was also horrifically rude. Duchess Victoria flexed her air in front of the British court often, rubbing her ability to bear children in the face of Adelaide, who, despite years of trying for a child, could not produce due to being too old. Her desire for power and control began to show with her own daughter, and she began to exhibit disturbing behaviour with her too. The famous stories of how Queen Victoria was brought up as a child are no myth, and the Duchess of Kent, who was used to getting her own way, controlled every little aspect of her life. This was when the famous Kensington System was born, and the bitter relationship between Victoria and her daughter began. The Kensington System was designed to keep young Victoria as far away from everyone as possible. The Duchess forced the girl to sleep with her every night, refused her nearly all playmates except for the family dog, and put her under a strict tutoring regime to turn her into the perfect ruler. Oh, and she especially kept the girl away from King William's side of the family. She did not do this alone. She had a partner in crime who had become one of the most hated men of Queen Victoria upon her reign. Duchess Victoria and her beloved partner John Conroy also had a huge hand in building it. Conroy took on the system as his own, showing even more devotion to it than the Duchess herself. Unsurprisingly, nearly everyone in court hated Conroy too, and he earned the spiteful nickname King John for all of the influence that he thought he had. Join me in part 2 to see how the Kensington System was the ultimate downfall and pushed her daughter further away from her, leading to Queen Victoria rebelling against her mother altogether. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.